And I'm going to start from question number 1, which requires us to write a Python function that calculates and returns the square of a given number. All right. So we said that the way to define a function, you start with the keyword def for define. All right. Then what follows should be the name of that function. Okay. So I can name my function square. All right. Then in here I have the parenthesis, and then I need to have the full colon. So basically, looking at the question, we are supposed to come up with a function that will calculate and return the square of a given number. So we need to underline a given number, because this tells us that the best way to approach this question is to have a function that takes in some parameter. Okay, so the parameter in question, we can talk about number or just num, no harm. So this is the given number in question that we are passing in here as a parameter. Okay, then in here we need to give a line that does exactly what this bit talks about. It calculates and returns the square of the given number. All right, so in here we can simply talk about return. And what are we returning? We are returning the number that has been passed in here as a parameter. And then to square that number, you can either multiply that number by itself, or the best one to use is doing that. All right, so this will square the given number and return that. All right, so again, if you remember, when we introduced about functions, we said that you can define a function as we have here, but if you don't call that function, then that means that that function will not be executed. Okay, so let us execute our script and experience that. See, we don't get anything simply because we have not called our function yet. Okay, so we come down here and talk about square. So the way to call the function, just call the function by the name that you have given it. Okay, then this function requires us to pass in some parameter. Having defined this, we need to pass in some value here. Okay, so for instance, we want the square of 5. All right, so that's the way to call a function. But the question is, if I execute the script, are we gonna get any output? Okay, we don't get any output for now. Okay, remember, the reason we are not getting an output, we said we need to instruct our script to print the output. Okay, remember, if you use the return keyword or the return statement, then for you to get an output on the console, you need to print whatever we have here. You need to print, then call your function. All right, so in case you do that, then we get an output. All right, the other way, we can also assign, say, x to our function, then we print x here. Remember, when you call this function, it will return this. So we are kind of assigning the square of this number to x. Then in here, we just need to print that x. All right, then we can also, basically that's what was expected of us in this question. All right, so on to the next question. So we have question number 2 here that requires us to write a function that takes a person's age as an input and prints a greeting message. Okay, so we have already done this a number of times. So remember, to define a function, you start with the keyword define. All right, then you give your function a name. Okay, then the instruction tells us to have a function that takes a person's name. So this again is a function that takes in a parameter. So we are going to have greetings, then we can pass in the name. All right. Then again, we can either return or print. So in here, we are required to print a greeting message. So we can talk about print. And what are we printing? So remember, let's format the string here. We can talk about hello, then we pass in the name. All right, and that is enough. So again, that is what is expected of us in this question. But then we wouldn't want just to leave it at that. We would want to proceed and test if this function works as expected. So the way to do that, we call the function. Remember, defining a function is one thing and calling a function, the function is another thing. So we need to call the function, then pass in our name, or just the name of the user you want to pass the greetings to. All right. So again, if I execute this, we see we are able to do that. All right. And of course, we said you can be able to execute the same function a number of times, passing in different parameters. All right. All right. So again, that is what was expected of us in that question. We have question number 3. So this question, this question requires us to define a function that takes a number as an input and checks if it is even or odd. Okay, so in here we are supposed to come up with a function, and again to define a function, you start with the keyword define, that is def, right? Then we need to give our function a name, check if it's even or odd. So we can talk about check even. Okay, check even or odd. Okay, then again we need to take in the number. All right, then in here, remember how we used to check even number is even or odd. So one is that we use the modulus operator to see if this number modulus 2 is equals to 0. Remember, a number is even if it is divisible by 2. So to check for the divisibility of 2, we talk about if num, that is this number we just passed in here as a parameter. Then we make use of the modulus operator 2. So we are checking if that will return 0, then that simply means that this number is an even number. All right. So again, we just proceed and talk about print. Then let's talk about, we format that. The number then is even. All right. Else, just print, print what you have here is odd. All right. So again, in here, we need to call the function. So again, calling the function, you can simply talk about check even underscore odd, then pass in the number. All right. So let's talk about 20. Execute our program again, and we see that 20 is even. We can talk about 21, and we see that 21 is odd. And of course, you can test using any other number. All right. So again, that is what was expected of us in that question. All right. So the next problem requires us to develop a function that calculates the area of a rectangle, allowing users to specify the length and the width as parameters. I believe this one is a bit easy, having gone through or the previous examples. Again, we said we start with the keyword def for define. Then we give our function a name. So we talk about area of rectangle. Okay. Then in here we need to pass in the length and the width. All right. So you can decide to call them X and Y, but then those may not be the best parameter names to use. So let's exactly call them the length and width. Then in here we can either talk about so we are told that develop that calculates allowing the users. All right, so we can either talk about print or return. So I'll talk about return, and what are we returning? We are returning the length times width. Remember how we used to get the area of a rectangle? That is the length times width. Again, that is what is expected of us in that question, just coming up with such a function. But we would want to move to the next step and test if our function works as expected. All right, so the way to test that, we can talk about call the function, then pass in the length and the width. All right, then remember, if you are making use of the return statement here, and you call the function this way, you are not gonna get anything on your console. So you need to print. If you execute, you get the area here. All right. So just provide any values and test your function. So on to the next question here. So we are supposed to write a function that accepts a temperature in Celsius and returns the equivalent temperature in Fahrenheit. All right. All right. So in here, we at least need to appreciate how to go about converting between Celsius and Fahrenheit. All right. So we are going to check for that here. All right. So we have the formula here. So we have the degrees, and all right, so we can try to first of all work around this formula and see how it works. So for instance, let me just copy what we have here. Okay, so that's what we have. So in case we are given the temperature, say we are given the temperature as 20. Okay, so to get the equivalence of Fahrenheit, what we need to do is to substitute that in our formula here. So in that case, we are going to have, say, the temperature, which is 20. We multiply by 9 divided by 5, and after doing that, we proceed to add 32. All right. So we are supposed to come up with a function that consumes this formula. All right. So that by just passing in the temperature, we get an output of that temperature in Celsius being converted to Fahrenheit. All right. So we can define a function that we are going to talk about Celsius to Fahrenheit. All right, that's the name of our function. Then in here we can talk about Celsius. So again, we want to return something. All right, so we can talk about Fahrenheit here is equals to, so we are talking about Celsius. Then we proceed and multiply that by 9, divide by 5. Okay, so we can have this into brackets. All right, then we add 32. All right, then we can have the return statement returning Fahrenheit. All right, so again, I can comment this one out. All right, so let's proceed and do a test of this. So again, I can simply print. So for us to execute this, I need to call the function, remember? So I'll do that. Then say pass in 40 degrees Celsius. Then for us to get something on the console, we need to print. All right, so let me try and execute this and see. So we get 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can try to make use of this calculator here. So we have 40 degrees and we see we have this has 40 degrees Celsius has been converted to 104. Okay, how about 100? Let's see, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so let's try here. 100, we see 212. All right, so in here, besides you being knowledgeable of how to go about creating a function, you also need to at least have this formula. Okay, so that is again what was expected of us in that problem. So moving on to the next question. In here, we are supposed to develop a function that takes a list of numbers and returns the maximum value in the list. All right, this is another interesting one. Right, so we are supposed to create a function. So again, remember, define, or rather def keyword for define. So we are defining a function, and we can talk about the name of the function being get max, the maximum number. Then in here we can pass in num, or that being the name of the list. Remember, num should be a list. All right, so in here we can add some description, and remember, for this description not to be executed, you make it a comment. All right, where num is a list. All right, a list of numbers. All right, then we proceed to, we can return, we can print. So in here we are supposed to return the maximum value in the list. So we can talk about return. Remember how we get the maximum value from a given list? We simply talk about the max, then we pass in the list. As simple as that. So again, in case we are to execute that, remember we call the function, then we pass in the parameter. So in this case, the parameter needs to be a list. So the way to declare a list, remember data types, we need to declare them using those square brackets. All right, then we pass in some random numbers here. All right, then we need to execute our script. But remember, since we are making use of the return statement, we need to print this so that we can get some output from the console. All right, so you can see the maximum is 10. So if we add, say, 70 here, execute it again, we get the maximum as 70. All right, so again, that is what was expected of us in that question. Okay, so on to the next question here, requiring us to create a function that accepts a string and a number n, all right, and returns the string repeated n times. Okay, another interesting question. So in here we are supposed to define. So we are supposed to define a function. So we need to give our function a name. Okay, so let's talk about repeat string. All right, so that's the name of the function. Then we can again talk about string. Okay, then n number of times. Those are the parameters that we need to pass through this function. As the question says, create a function that accepts a string, okay, and a number n as parameters and return a string repeated n times. All right, so just a quick check. So for instance, if I have hello, I can be able to multiply this by a number by 3. All right, so see, we have hello 3 times. So maybe to have it look better, you can add a space there, and we see we have hello 3 times. So basically this is what this question is saying. So we repeat a string a number of times. So again, we can do return. So in here, we are talking about the string, and we are multiplying by a number n. Okay. So again, when calling the function, we need to have repeat string. Then we pass in the string there and the number. All right. So we can have some space there, then proceed to execute our script. Again, we don't get an output. Reason being, here we are talking about return. So when calling our function, you must print. Okay, so just pass in your string here, whatever string you prefer, and then the number of times you would want that string to be repeated. All right. All right. So let me share this with you as well. All right. So on to the next question. Again, in here, we are supposed to write a function that takes two strings as input and returns a new string that concatenates the two inputs. All right. So again, I'll talk about define. All right. And instead of, for instance, let's use an example that we can be able to appreciate. So let me rephrase this question. It is the same, but using a scenario that we are able to appreciate. So I want to come up with a function that takes in the first name and the second name and returns first and second name together. All right. So I can talk about full name, all right, as the name of my function. Then I'll pass in some parameters, and some parameters here will be first name and last name. All right, and again, I can return first name plus last name. All right, so again, that is what is expected of us in that question. I just tweaked the question a little. It's the same concept because two strings, that is the first name and the second name, as the input, and returns a new string that concatenates the two inputs. So this is what we have. So in case we are to call that function, then we can have, so we need to pass in the first name. So we can have done as the first name, all right? Then the second name, I'll use an abbreviation, all right? So in case we are to see something on the console, we need to print this. Reason being, we have used return here. So to see something on the console, we need to print. So in case you execute this, you get the two strings concatenated. But since we wanted to see the full name, it is good enough to leave some space there. So again, that is what was expected of us in this question. That is that for that question. Again, let's see about this one. So define a function where a local variable has the same name as a global variable and demonstrate their differences. All right. All right. So we talked about local and global variables. Remember? So in here we can talk about. Let me talk about global global variable and say this is global variable. All right, then I define a function. Okay, local global, that's the name of our function. All right, so our function does not take in any parameters. Then okay, maybe this is not the best name because I would want to give the local variable the same name as we have here. So let me just call this var. Okay, then in here I also call it var. Then this is local variable. All right, we want to see the difference. So if this function is called, we want to print var. All right, which again, okay, so in here we can do something instead of just printing that, and we will not know if it's from the function. We can say from the function. I think we might not need, okay, let me have a plus here. All right, I hope I haven't confused anyone. This is an alternative to using the format method. This is also usable. All right, so in here we call the function local global. Okay, that's good enough. Then we can proceed and print. We can proceed and print. Okay, even before we print, if we execute this program, let's see, we get from the function, this is local variable. Okay, then if we print this, okay, global variable, then I can talk about plus var. All right, so if I execute these two, so see what we have. Executing or calling the function, we get whatever we have defined within the function. This is local variable as we have here. All right, then for the global variable, in case we print what you have here, again we get exactly what we defined here. Okay, so remember about the differences between local variable and global variable. Okay, so what we say, a local variable is defined within a function. Okay, and it is only available when the function is called. Okay, and it is immediately destroyed once the function has completed execution. All right, again for the global variable, this is created outside the function and can be accessed anywhere, whether outside the function or inside the function. We can also be able to access it within this function. And it's about its availability. It is available within the life cycle of this script. All right. So that is basically what was expected of us, just to have an understanding of what it means by a global variable and a local variable, and how you can go about just showing the difference when you define the local variable within a function and try to print it. Remember, we gave them the same names, and we would have expected, for instance, let me just give another example here. For instance, if I talk about x is equals to 10, okay, then down here I come and say x is equals to 2, then proceed to print x. All right, so what happens, let's see. Okay, we are focusing on this. So see, the variable x has been updated to 2, but look, in here we defined the global variable, and in case this local variable was accessible globally, then we would have expected that this updates the data in here. Okay, so that means probably calling this function, that is calling the function and printing the global variable here, would have returned the same output. But see, we have different output simply because the local variable, uh, the local variable here, the one that we defined here, did not update the global variable. All right. So that is it. And to the next question here. So we are supposed to come up with a function that modifies the global variable in, okay, we need to write a function that modifies a global variable inside it using the global keyword. All right. So I hope we remember we covered such an example yesterday. So we can talk about global variable here. We talk of this being 10. Then we can talk about define a function and modify. We can call this modify global variable. All right. Then we need not pass in any parameter. We don't need one. Then in here we said you can to modify a global variable within a function. We need to call the global keyword within the function. So we call that keyword global, then reference the variable name of the global variable that we want to modify. So having called it global variable, this is just any variable name. It is not so special. Okay, I could have named it X, Y, or just any other name. It's only that I wanted to ensure that the name is at least you're able to appreciate that this has been defined as a global variable and we want to modify it within a function. So we call global, then the name of the variable that we want to modify. All right. So once we do that, then we can proceed to modify the global variable within this function. So we can talk about global variable and we can multiply this by 20 or just any other operation. The goal is to show how you modify a global variable within a function. So whether it is adding to, whether it is multiplying by 2, divide by, any type of modification that you can do to this function. All right. So again, uh, for this to reflect, we need to call the function. So you can call the function here. All right. And for now, the function is not supposed to return anything, but it is supposed to modify the global variable. So just call the function and proceed to print the global variable in here. All right. So let us see if this 10 will be multiplied by 20. All right. So see, we have been able to modify the global variable within the function and we are able to see that value. All right. So what happens if you don't call the function? Let's see. All right. So if you don't call the function, that means this whatever happened within the function is not known. Okay. So you need to call the function for this update or this modification to actually reflect. So that's why we do that and we get exactly what we expected. All right. So that's again how to approach that kind of question. And to the last question in the list here. So we are supposed to create a function that uses a nested function to access a variable defined in the outer function. Okay, so this concept is known as closure concept. All right, so you can be able to define a function within another function. Let us see how. So in here, we can talk about define. We define an outer function. And remember, the name is not so not so special. This is just like any other name that we are giving to our function, but for this case, it has been named outer function to be able to distinguish it with the inner function. Okay, so in here we can pass in a message, maybe MSG message, or just any data that you pass in there, because we want this to be reflected in the inner function as well. All right, so again, we define an inner function within the outer function. So we can talk about inner function. All right, so in this we may not need to pass in any parameter. Then we can talk about print. We want to print the message. We talk about MSG, so we need to format this. All right, so look, we have the inner function, and when this function is called, it is supposed to print what we have here. All right, and once we do that again, so basically when the outer function is called, it should return the inner function. All right, look at what you have. Call the outer function, it should return the inner function. But then what does the inner function do? It is supposed to print some message. Okay, and this message was passed through the outer function. All right, so let's see how to again to go about executing that. So like you can talk about exec outer function. All right, so we want to execute the outer function, and we will talk about outer function. Then remember, when calling the outer function, we need to pass in some message. All right, so hello, this is from the outer function. All right, so look, you call the outer function, okay, and pass in the parameter here. All right, so calling the outer function returns the inner function. Okay, so what this one has is that it holds the inner function. All right, so again we need to call the variable that we have here. And how do we do that? We simply do that. I hope it makes sense. So see, we have the outer function holding the inner function. Okay, and when the outer function is called, it is supposed to return the inner function. All right, so in here we call the outer function and pass in the parameter here. Okay, so when this one is called, it returns whatever we have here. So for us to now execute and get the output of the inner function, we need to call it this way. Okay, so think of this as the name given to the inner function. And the way to call the inner function is by using the name of the inner function and having those parentheses. All right, so in case we execute this script, see, the message is what we have here. All right, again, that's how to make use of the outer function and the inner function, or the closure concept. All right, so let us do these two questions, and I'll leave the rest for you to try. All right, so this question requires us to create a Python module, all right, math operations.py, containing functions addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Import the module and use its function. All right, so remember how to go about creating some modules. So I'll do this. Okay, I'll create a new file here. So this new file is supposed to have some functions, addition. Okay, let me just copy what we have here. So in here, we are supposed to have some three functions. Did I leave out any function? We have four. Okay, and division. Okay. So in here, we should, so we are supposed to create functions for these mathematical operations. All right. So I'll start with addition and I'll talk about define addition. So addition will take in, say, x and y. These are some two numbers that we want to add, and we will return x plus y. All right. When it comes to subtraction, we are going to talk about define. Then our function, we give our function the name subtraction. Then we will have x and y. Okay. So we then return x minus y. All right. So these are the four functions that we were required to create. Then import them. Let me see. Okay. So let me see. So create a Python module that containing functions for those. Import this module and use its function. So we are going to do the importation here. But for multiplication, okay, so for multiplication, this we can have this treated as a special case because again, remember, if we were to divide, let me show you something. So if you were to divide, say we have to divide by 0, our system will crash. Anyway, at this stage, we are still not yet checking for such errors, but we can just try and add a line here that will help us avoid dividing a number by 0. So in here, we can just check if y is not equals to 0, then we return that. So this needs to be indented. All right. Else you can return some statement here, maybe saying return. We can't do that. All right. Well, good enough for now. So these are the four functions. And remember how we talked about importing the functions. Okay. So to import the functions, we talk about import. So there is this name here that we named our module. So basically this is the file containing our function or rather our functions. So we are going to talk about import math operations. All right. So we would want to do some additions. So we are going to talk about math operations dot. Do we have addition? All right. Then pass in the x and y. So for the x we can have 10. For the y we can have 20. All right. Again, because we made use of the return statement, we can simply have print. All right. So in case we do that, we get 30. And of course, within the return statement, you can add some flavors. Talk of the sum of x and y is equals to and such kind of information. All right. For now, this is good enough. All right. So in case again we want to make use of we have multiplication, we can talk about math operations dot multiplication. What are we multiplying? We are multiplying 6 by 9. All right. Again, because we made use of the return statement, we need to print. If we do that, we have 9 times 6 times 9, that gives us 54. All right. So the next operation, division. Let's try division. What are we dividing by what? We are dividing, we can have 12 and 3. Okay, again, we made use of the return statement, so we need to print that. Again, if we execute our program, we get 4.0. So how about if we have a 0 here? We can't do that. All right, but again, we are going to see how to be handling the errors that we expected to get here. All right, but again, this is another approach that we can use. All right, then that's for we are here to do subtraction. So we have math operations dot, we have subtraction. Again, we have 10 and 6. Let's see if we get the right answer for that. Then we proceed and execute our program. Okay, so 10 minus 6, we get 4. So that's simply how to go about creating uh, creating a custom module and importing and using it. Okay, so just a quick demo on how to go about instead of importing everything. Remember what we said in our previous session is that we can talk of okay, from math operations import, we can import each and every function one by one. So for instance, if we just wanted to make use of the addition, we just do addition. Then when making use of the addition here, we just talk about addition. Then we pass in the two numbers that we want to add. Okay. Then remember, we can proceed and print. So this is the second approach that we can use. But again, you need to import each and every function. But we do not make use of this right several times. We just have to have a comma, import multiplication, division, and all that. All right. But again, when executing those functions, you omit the math operations because you imported each and every function as it is. All right, that is that. Let's see this. Create a Python script that imports your custom module and uses its function to perform calculations. So basically, this is what we have just done here. Okay, because the Python script, we already had one in question, that is hero.py, and we have been able to import our custom modules, and we have used those functions to perform the different calculations that we have seen here. So that is done.